You ever notice how the moment you stop giving someone your energy, suddenly they start giving you theirs? It's not magic. It's psychology. Most of us have been trained to think that if we just try harder, give more, prove ourselves, then we'll be valued. But here's the twisting. The moment you stop feeding his ego is the moment he starts wondering why he lost your attention. This isn't about playing games. It's about shifting power. And when you stop orbiting around his need for validation, something amazing happens. He starts orbiting around you. When you stop feeding his ego, something powerful happens. You interrupt a pattern he's gotten used to. Most people, especially those who are used to getting attention, operate on a kind of psychological autopilot. Their ego gets stroked regularly by compliments, attention, texts, likes, laughs, and the general sense that people are leaning in toward them. And while that may feel good in the moment, it doesn't create a lasting emotional connection. It creates a loop where they get used to attention being a constant and where they rarely have to work for someone's interest. So when you step back and stop giving him that easy approval, you're not just disappearing. You're sending a very loud, silent message. You don't need to compete for his validation. And that message breaks the rhythm. Suddenly, he's no longer in a world where he's the one being chased. Instead, he's left with an uncomfortable question he hasn't had to ask himself in a while. Why isn't she responding the way others do? This disruption causes him to pause. And in that pause, where he's no longer being fed the dopamine of constant attention, a gap is created. That gap is where curiosity lives. Curiosity is incredibly powerful in attraction. Think about the people you've been drawn to in the past. Wasn't part of the attraction the fact that you didn't know everything about them right away? That they had layers? That they weren't immediately predictable or overly eager to please? When you stop feeding his ego, you automatically introduce that mystery. He can't quite figure you out. He doesn't know where he stands with you. And because his ego is no longer being inflated by your every move, he begins to feel something unfamiliar. Intrigue. He wonders what you're thinking, why you pulled back, and most importantly, whether he actually mattered as much as he assumed he did. And this shift doesn't just pique interest. It raises your perceived value. When you're always available, always validating, you become part of the background noise. Nice, pleasant, but not unforgettable. But when you become a little less accessible, when your energy becomes a little more selective, suddenly he has to earn it. That's when attention becomes meaningful, because people don't value what is endlessly offered. They value what is earned. You transform from someone who gives away energy freely to someone whose attention feels like a privilege. Not because you're trying to manipulate, but because you're acting from a place of self-respect and emotional maturity. And here's what most people miss: this isn't about punishing him. It's not about pretending not to care. It's about choosing where your energy goes. When you stop feeding his ego, you stop fueling a dynamic where he gets the reward without the effort. And when that effort becomes necessary, he either steps up or reveals he was only ever in it for the validation. Either way, you win. You either attract a more genuine form of interest, or you make space for someone who's emotionally available and grounded enough to meet you at your level. But it all starts with this one shifter, choosing to let go of the need to impress and allowing the silence of your absence to speak volumes. Because once you stop feeding his ego, you're no longer just another source of attention. You're the person he suddenly can't stop thinking about. Pulling back is often mistaken for manipulation, but in reality, it's one of the clearest ways to communicate self-worth. When you choose to take a step back, not out of anger, but from clarity, you're making a powerful statement. I don't need to chase someone to feel valued. That message says more about your emotional strength than anything you could say with words. It's not about withholding affection or playing games. It's about recognizing the energy exchange and deciding you won't keep giving when it's not being reciprocated in a meaningful way. People who are used to being chased rarely stop to consider the impact of their own actions. They don't have to. The attention keeps coming. But when you're the one who quietly pulls your energy away, something subtle shifts. You're not reacting. You're not begging. You're not trying to be seen. You're simply stepping into your own space, deciding that your attention is not a given. It's a choice, and one that has to be earned. That shift is powerful because it disrupts their expectation. They were used to being centered in the dynamic, and suddenly, they're not. The truth is, we teach people how to treat us by what we tolerate and how much we overextend ourselves in pursuit of connection. When someone sees that you continue to give even when they give little in return, it sets the toning. They start believing your love is unconditional, even in the absence of effort. But when you pull back, not out of bitterness, but out of alignment with your own value, you communicate something different. You show that you're not here to overfunction emotionally, that you're not going to fill in the gaps they leave. This is where the real power lies. You're not trying to make someone chase you. You're simply removing yourself from a dynamic that doesn't feel reciprocal. And when you do that, the contrast becomes clear. Suddenly, they realize that something is missing, that they no longer have access to the same warmth, the same energy, the same effort. And that realization forces them to reflect, not necessarily out of fear of loss, but because something feels different. It's not as easy anymore. They're not being passively adored. They have to show up or risk being left behind. There's a difference between emotional availability and emotional over-giving. The latter often comes from insecurity, the fear that if we stop proving our worth, we'll lose the connection. But real confidence is quiet. It says, if you don't see my value, I won't keep trying to convince you. I'll just go where I'm valued. And that mindset doesn't just shift the dynamic, it transforms it. When you stop trying to impress and instead focus on aligning with your own standards, your presence becomes something people value more. Not because you made them feel small, but because you made yourself feel whole. You respected yourself enough to stop giving out energy that wasn't being appreciated. And in doing that, you changed the relationship without saying a word. This isn't about ego. It's about emotional integrity. When you pull back with grace, you're showing that your love, your time, your attention, none of it is casual. It's meaningful. It's intentional. And the moment someone realizes that they either rise to meet your standard or fall away, either way, you gain clarity. And more importantly, you remain grounded in your worth, not because someone else sees it, but because you do. The ego is constantly looking for fuel, attention, praise, validation. It thrives when it feels in control, especially in relationships where one person gives and the other receives without much effort. When someone is used to being chased or admired, they come to expect it as the norm. Their ego begins to rely on that steady stream of external affirmation to feel important, attractive, or in control of the dynamic. But when that flow suddenly stops, when you go quiet, when you stop reacting, that same ego experiences something it doesn't know how to handle: uncertainty. Silence is uncomfortable for the ego because it can't interpret it easily. A compliment, a laugh, a message, all of those are signals it can consume and use to reinforce its sense of power. But silence creates a gap, and that gap makes room for questions the ego doesn't like asking. Why did she stop texting first? Did I lose her interest? What changed? These are not questions born out of genuine self-reflection. They're born out of ego discomfort. It's the beginning of a shift in control, and it catches him off guard because it wasn't a confrontation or an argument. It was just less effort, less reaction, less energy poured into feeding his sense of importance. What's so powerful about this is that it's not about manipulation. It's about balance. If you were always the one making the effort, always the one keeping the connection alive, then your energy was being taken for granted. When that dynamic is interrupted, it forces the other person to engage differently, or not at all. And if they don't step forward to fill the space, that tells you everything you need to know. but often they do step forward, not necessarily because they've had a grand revelation about their feelings, but because their ego is sounding the alarm. It's suddenly not being fed, and it's craving that fix. It needs to restore the equilibrium where it felt admired and pursued. There's a certain irony here. The very attention you gave so freely is what made it feel disposable. And the absence of that attention is what now makes it feel valuable. It's human nature to become used to what is always available. But when something, or someone, is suddenly no longer predictable, it forces awareness. Your silence becomes the loudest thing in the room, and because the ego can't control silence, it can't sit comfortably in it. It pushes the person to act, to figure out what went wrong, to re-establish the feeling of being wanted. The crucial thing here is your intention. If your silence is coming from resentment or as a tactic to get a specific response, it won't carry the same power. But if it's coming from clarity, from genuinely deciding that you're not going to pour energy into a one-sided dynamic, it shifts everything. You're no longer part of the ego's cycle. You're not playing the same game. You've chosen a different path, one where your attention is intentional, not automatic. In that moment, you stop being a source of ego gratification and start becoming a person of value. Not because you're holding back love, but because you're showing that your love isn't something to be taken lightly. The ego can't control what it doesn't understand, and your detachment, your calm, quiet absence, becomes a mystery it feels compelled to solve. And in trying to solve it, it's no longer you chasing him. It's him finally noticing what he took for granted. Trying to impress someone often comes from a place of insecurity, even when it's dressed up as confidence. It's the impulse to prove your worth, to show them you're fun enough, attractive enough, smart enough, desirable enough. And while the intention might be to draw someone closer, what often happens is the opposite. The more you try to impress, the more you signal that their approval matters more than your authenticity. And that imbalance is felt, even if it's not spoken. People might not be able to name it, but they can sense it. That you're giving too much too quickly, and that you're seeking their validation rather than standing in your own. Ironically, the most attractive version of you is the one that's not trying too hard. It's not the overly curated, overly agreeable, overly invested version. It's the one that's grounded real and not obsessed with being liked. That version doesn't seek constant reassurance. It doesn't need to be loud or performative. It's just present, confident in its own value, whether someone else sees it right away or not. And that quiet kind of self-possession, it's magnetic, because in a world where everyone is trying to be the most of something, hot, clever, charming, someone who just is, who's not trying to win, stands out. When you stop trying to impress, you stop doing emotional labor for someone else's benefit. You stop measuring your actions by how they'll be received, and you start focusing on what's true for you, what feels natural, what feels respectful to your own energy. That shift creates space for real connection, not performance-based attraction, but emotional resonance. You're not trying to be the highlight of their day. You're just being yourself, which ironically ends up being far more memorable. This doesn't mean you become passive or disinterested. It means you're intentional. You're not seeking someone's attention just to feel good about yourself. You're observing how they show up. You're watching if the connection feels mutual. And you're staying rooted in your worth, whether they validate it or not. That's not aloofness. It's emotional maturity. It shows that you don't need to impress because you already know you bring value to the table. What happens next is often surprising. When you stop trying so hard, people start leaning in because now they're curious. They're intrigued. They can't quite figure you out, and that makes them want to know more. You're not a puzzle they can solve in a few texts or a single date. You're layered. You're not broadcasting your every thought or emotion to win them over. And that restraint doesn't come across as disinterest. It comes across as depth. This shift also protects your energy. When you're constantly trying to impress, you're often overriding your own boundaries. You say yes when you want to say no. You laugh at things that don't feel genuine. You agree to plans, ideas, or values that don't fully align with you, just to keep things smooth or likable. But when you drop the need to be impressive, you reclaim your truth. And when you live in that truth, the right people find you. Not because you chased them, but because your self-assurance drew them in. You stop being the person who's always available, always eager, always accommodating. You become the person they can't stop thinking about, not because you did the most, but because you didn't need to. You let your presence speak for itself. And in a world that's constantly trying to sell, impress, and win attention, that kind of quiet confidence is unforgettable. When you stop feeding someone's ego, you're not just adjusting your behavior. You're changing the entire structure of the dynamic between you. It's not about revenge or withholding. It's about choosing to no longer participate in a one-sided game. You're no longer playing by the rules they've grown comfortable with. The ones where they lead with charm, you react with interest. They pull away, you chase, they give breadcrumbs, and you turn them into a meal. That pattern may have worked in the past because their ego was in control of the playing field. But the moment you step off that field, the game stops, and they don't know what to do next. That's the key difference. You didn't just play the same game with better moves. You stopped playing altogether. And by doing that, you forced a new dynamic to emerge, one in which your attention is no longer assumed, your time isn't guaranteed, and your emotional investment is no longer on autopilot. Now the question isn't whether you can hold his interest. It's whether he can meet your standard. That one shift flips the entire dynamic, not through force, but through self-respect. Most people are used to subtle control in relationships. They may not be consciously manipulative, but they know what gets a reaction. They know that if they go a little cold, pull back, become vague or emotionally unavailable, someone will usually lean in harder. That leaning in is what their ego feeds on. It confirms they're still wanted, still in control, still being prioritized without having to offer much in return. But when you don't respond in the way they expect, when you don't chase, don't explain, don't play into that push-pull energy, they lose that sense of control. And that creates discomfort. But discomfort isn't a bad thing. It's often the only thing that makes someone stop and reflect. Suddenly, they're no longer sure where they stand with you. They start wondering, did I misread her interest? Did I go too far? Is she even still into me? Those questions are what begin to dismantle the ego's hold on the connection. And in that space, there's room for something deeper to take its place. That's when they start realizing that your attention wasn't a given. It was a gift, something they had, but didn't fully appreciate until it wasn't there anymore. And now they have to work to get it back. Not because you're playing hard to get, but because you've evolved past needing to be seen by someone who isn't showing up fully. You've changed the criteria for engagement. You're not available for casual inconsistency. You're not participating in emotional breadcrumbing. You're not proving your worth to someone who hasn't proven theirs. That shift puts the pressure where it belongs on him to step up. If he values you, he has to show it in a way that's real. If he doesn't, then his absence only confirms what you already sensed. Either way, you've reclaimed your energy and redirected it toward yourself, your peace, and your own emotional alignment. And that clarity becomes your power. You didn't get smarter at playing the game. You simply stopped playing a rigged one. You raised the bar not by demanding more from him, but by expecting more for yourself. And that's not just attractive. That's rare, because most people don't know how to walk away from a dynamic that keeps them emotionally hooked. But when you do, calmly, gracefully, without drama, you stop being just another person feeding his ego. You become the person who made him question his own. Confidence doesn't always come dressed in bold words, loud opinions, or big gestures. The most powerful kind of confidence is often the quietest. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself, doesn't need to dominate the conversation, and doesn't need validation to feel secure. It's the kind that shows up as calm detachment. Not coldness, not indifference, but emotional composure. A sense of, I know my worth, and I won't overextend myself to convince you of it. When you embody that kind of energy, people feel it instantly. You don't need to chase, because you're not operating from a place of lack. You're not desperate to prove your value or earn someone's attention. You already know what you bring to the table, and you're simply observing whether the other person can match that. This quiet detachment is the opposite of being emotionally unavailable. It's not a wall, it's a boundary, one that says, if you want access to me, show up with intention. This is especially disarming to someone who's used to their ego being constantly fed. When someone is used to others trying to impress them, trying to win them over, or staying in the connection, no matter how inconsistent they are, they learn to assume that attention is a given. But when you don't follow that pattern, when you don't react strongly to their withdrawal, when you don't try to re-engage, when you don't panic or cling, they're left in unfamiliar territory. Their ego doesn't know how to interpret the silence. It can't understand why you're not trying harder. That's when they start to feel your absence, not just physically, but energetically. And that absence creates impact, because you haven't raised your voice or made a dramatic exit. You've simply stopped investing where there's no return. You've chosen stillness over reactivity. That's unsettling to someone who's used to having the upper hand, and it's incredibly attractive to someone who's looking for depth. It shows that you're not emotionally volatile. You're emotionally grounded. You don't need chaos to feel connected. You don't need someone to chase you to feel desirable. You've already claimed your value internally. This kind of quiet confidence doesn't just protect your peace. It elevates your presence. People begin to notice that you're not caught up in needing attention, that you can walk away from anything that doesn't serve you, that you can stay soft and kind without being overly available or easily manipulated. That's rare. And in a dating culture driven by instant gratification, people who can hold that space of calm detachment tend to stand out the most. It also changes the way you show up in your connections. You no longer tolerate mixed signals. You don't beg for clarity. You don't stay where you're not seen. You're not angry. You're just unavailable for games. And that makes others start to question whether they've shown up enough, whether they've taken your calm for granted, whether your distance isn't a tactic, but a response to their inconsistency. Eventually, that realization cuts through the ego's noise. The attention that once felt automatic is gone. The person who once responded to every nudge is now unavailable, not because they're bitter, but because they've outgrown the dynamic. That kind of detachment isn't performative. It's transformative. It signals growth, boundaries, and emotional self-respect. You don't need to prove your worth with more effort, more giving, more showing up. Sometimes the most powerful move is doing less and letting your absence reveal what your presence was really worth. In that silence, the right person won't just notice you. They'll realize they have to step up to be part of your world. So in the end, this isn't about ignoring someone to get a reaction. It's about choosing yourself in a world that constantly tells you to prove your worth to people who haven't earned access to you. You didn't starve his ego to play a game. You did it to break a pattern. You stopped feeding into dynamics that drained you, and in doing so, you forced a shift. One where you're no longer the one seeking validation, but the one standing in quiet confidence. And that's when everything changes. Because now he can't ignore you. Not because you raised your voice, because you raised your standard. Not because you became someone else, but because you finally chased to be fully, unapologetically yourself. You didn't chase. You didn't beg. You stepped back with grace. And in that space, you became the person he never saw coming and now can't stop thinking about.